is fair and what's not. Like the old man can tend the teepee. He's had a long life or something like this. You know, this is my sort of objection in a way to like universal basic income, is that like we as a society need to decide what is fair and what isn't. And that's like proof of work, really, in a sense. It's proof of value, right? And without that, we're just sort of like imposing some sort of generic rule, like a machine on top of us. So it's like, you know, you can understand the need for some sort of like steering. And I feel like the universalness of basic income, in a way, like it just sort of, to me, it's the opposite of community currency, where that is basically saying everyone should be able to create their own income, right? I mean, you can say there's barriers to entry. You've got to be 16 years old. You've got to be able to read and write, you know, things like that, right? Like you say, do minors belong in a basic income? Why are minors, you know, making an income? Aren't they being cared for? Aren't they dependents of others? So anyways, I'll stop there. That's my introduction. Okay, I'll say one thing about the potluck. So the idea there is to say, okay, what are the basic rules a group can come together and decide how to collectively create a credit together? A currency, collateral behind it, you know, how do we do it safely? How do we trust each other? Is there some level of allowance of teepee tending? For instance, if someone comes in and says, I'm committed to X, and I'm not going to put in any collateral, and other people do it for you, right? Like they've contributed, and then you get a bunch of tokens, and you spend them, and then you don't do anything in return for it. Like you've sort of like broken the wheel, you know? Like there's like a little gap there where you were. So that's an example of like kind of teepee tending in a way. You know, that's even worse than teepee tending. Teepee tending is a little bit neutral. You know, in some ways, being into like social debt in a sense is not neutral. It's sort of negative.
This is fascinating. Like so much of what you're saying is really inside of a social construct of money and how we've been trained to think about money. And it's really fascinating. Like, so for example, you're talking about in your currencies, which are backed currencies, it's really a different set of agreements than a mutual credit currency. Where in a mutual credit currency, there's nothing wrong with being in debt. Some people always have to be in debt because otherwise the mutual credit currency doesn't work. So in a mutual credit currency, being in debt isn't worse than being in a positive number. But because of the way that our current social construct, which is called money, and it completely, I mean, this is the first thing, right? Money is a completely invented social construct. And even the ownership of land is a completely invented social construct.
Yeah.
Right?
But that's our job, though, is to invent social constructs. Like that's right. Kind of my point. It's just that, like, instead of, so the mutual credit, again, it's a machinist rule. It's like credit equals debt, right? There's no sort of variation to that in a way, right?
Yeah,
There's no room for surplus, in fact, at all in that sort of system, because as soon as you sort of like glutton on to your negative or positive credit in mutual credit, you've sort of like stopped the system in a way.
Well, I'm fascinated by what you're, you know, like one of the things that you're saying is like, it's really is, so this is a little bit, I mean, like I'm gonna like get into a little bit of mind stuff, but when you talk about surplus, you're talking about surplus money, like as the main form of capital. But if you look at the spreadsheet that you started for this community currency potluck, which is like, it's a great way to start, right? So first of all, we haven't created the community consensus yet. Is the consensus that this is gonna, you know, people are gonna put in collateral or not? And is the consensus that people are gonna get some tokens up front or not? We haven't decided yet. You know, there's a particular construct you're inviting us into. But this thing is like, that spreadsheet is pretty much 100% surplus. Here are some people with some surplus services to give. They've got some surplus time and some surplus services, and they'd like to give them to the community. So for me, that's surplus.
But are the needs surplus? Can you have a surplus of need? Is that possible?
Well, again, one of the things that's really problematic in much, you know, in the Western society is really a differentiation between needs and wants. I didn't put on anything there that I needed. I only put in things I want, because I'm really willing to give generously of things that are surplus to me to get things that are surplus to other people. But,
Yeah.
you know, until a
Yeah, yeah,
farmer
yeah.
shows up on that list, right?
It's a little bit like, are you more willing to be an employer or an employee? Right? Would you rather spend your labor, or would you rather spend your capital or credit?
Well, again, employer employee, it's in this very weird construct of capitalism and of money. Like, money is a really weird construct that is becoming out, you know, becoming more and more apparent, the drawbacks of it. And in some places, the financial system is in collapse. And so inventing new social constructs is, you know, it's important now. And then, you know, that's inside of this question of like, what's a free rider? What's a rent seeker? I mean, to me, in some ways, you know, a rent seeker, in some ways, rent seeking is almost, you know, saying I own this apartment building and I own this land is in a way already rent seeking, because God gave us this land, right? If you say I'm going to charge people to go to the beach, like that's, you know, that is rent seeking, but we don't think of it that way. Like, the beach was given by God, but now you got to pay me for it. Like, how did I come into the beach?
I mean, in a lot of basic incomes, they're really too simplistic, but they, you know, like, so basically a child being born is now a rent on the world, which kind of makes sense in a way. Like, it created some inflation, perhaps, in some versions of basic income, right? And is that an acceptable rent? And I guess that's just what we choose, you know? And so, like, that's again back to the steering wheel kind of thing. Like, you have generic blasé, you know, machinist constructions and at what level do you need those? Because at some level we use those in our currencies as well, like even with the bonding curve, like there's an equation, right? Like, there's not some person changing the parameters of the equation every single day. You can make dynamic equations, but again, you're still like pushing the machine part to, like, you know, the axle or the engine and there's still some sort of steering wheel.
Yeah, and I agree with you about universal basic income. I kind of feel like it should be a little bit more like the way that healthcare and education are given out, right? Like, there should just be a supermarket you can go to and get food that's free, and then we could do away with income. It's like, obviously you have the right to eat, but that's about, you know, you get healthcare, you get education, you get food, you know, the rest is up to you, and then you don't have to have this money floating around. So I'm just going to say what a word about this potluck. So what Will's doing is trying to create a kind of community currency among whoever wants to join the Telegram group. So if you're interested, let any of us know, and we'll just, myself, Adam, and Will are in there. And so anybody who wants can join and add other people. So maybe somebody else will jump in on this lively discussion. Yeah, Adam.
I like this topic that we've started down. And I like Will's take on it, or I like hearing his take on it at least. I have a question about how so in the system that you're describing, Will, how do you get rid of debt, excess debt? Let me give an easy example, and then I guess in the more complex example, maybe it's harder to figure this out, but so my wife and my sisters and a bunch of other people in the community are part of this babysitting co-op where they trade their time. And so if you get this negative balance, you have to work to get it back up to zero or positive or whatever. So that seems to work pretty well. And there's like this social pressure to get it back up to zero and stuff like that they kind of like exert on each other to some extent, usually in nice ways. And then but if it's a more complex like system, like, you know, you're giving me eggs and I'm giving you computer programming or something like that, then like how do you get rid of a negative balance?
Well, okay, so trade balance and your debt limit are two different things. So like what we think of as a bank balance or a token balance, right, is sort of a recording of like, how deep do you want to go towards zero? But on another scale, you could say, well, trade balance, let's say you started an account at some time with 500 in it, and now it's up to 1,000. So I have a, plus a 500 trade balance, right? So the zero in a mutual credit is sort of this meaningless number in a way. I mean, yes, credits always match debts, but that doesn't tell you anything about the credit space that's been created. And I think that's sort of the most important thing that mutual credit's going to gloss over. They say, oh yeah, it's all zeros. Like, what do you mean it's all zeros? Like, what does that mean to you? Because, what's the size of your space? So you could still, in a system where you start at 20,000, you could go negative, 20,000, and then you wouldn't be able to go more negative than that because you'd be at absolute zero in that case in terms of your token amount. So I think that like, okay, so getting rid of that negative, I mean, just like, but in the sense of debt, not in terms of like, math stuff, is to me about who is holding that debt, right? And the problem with society, the way we have it right now, is that debt has been like blurred out into the quote unquote economy, right? Who owns that debt? You have no idea, right? It's just like we live in this weird space where we don't even know who we're in debt to, in a way, right? Like, it's like banks, and it's a really abstract layer, which is fine at maybe a next layer up. But the idea is to say in a local currency system that your creditors and your debtors, like it's a publicly known situation, right? Which is quite obvious. It's a public blockchain, like you can just see, where people are compared to where they started, right? And so in that case, there's forgiveness is possible in that situation. I mean, it's a social thing and it has to be determined in a certain way, and that could have some algorithms to it. But I mean, the way they do it in villages here is just that. I mean, sometimes there's a debt that's carried over to the next year in terms of reputation, right? Maybe you don't get as many Harambes in your name kind of thing the next year. Your kids' birthdays aren't celebrated as much. There's a lot of that sort of stuff that's also in some ways worse, right? Like debts do kind of carry over in some ways. And I think that's also like in terms of relationships, like how many times did you wash the dishes and all that kind of stuff, like, so I like the idea that debt is erased by erasing it, like consciously, in some way, and that could be algorithmic or something like that. And I like those cycles, and I like the scale of it too. It basically says like, the function of debt erasure is a process of those people involved, right? Anyways, that's my.
Yeah, I mean, I love that, and that goes back to what you were saying about like universal basic income and who gets to decide. Because like Adam, when you were telling me that situation, it just like broke my heart. And the same thing when Will was saying like, oh, if your parent is in debt, then you're going to have fewer birthday parties. Like, it just breaks my heart to hear people like, you're in a babysitting circle where a whole bunch of people are supposed to help each other. And somebody who's got, certain obligations, maybe they're more working class and they need to work more hours, or maybe they've got more children, or maybe they have a parent who's sick, and you're like, well, you got to get to zero. Like, I would never want to be in that babysitting circle. I would not want to be in that baby. It was just like that my friends would keep tabs and make me work harder at a difficult time in my life. Fuck that.
Right.
Like, because when my kids are teenagers, I'll pay you back those hours for free. I've got free teenagers, right? Like, oh my God,
Yeah.
like that's just so horrifying. And the fact, and Will wrote a recent blog post about that in these circles, that the women, they get together at the end of the year and they look at everybody's debts and they decide as a community, are we going to forgive some people or not?
How do you, I'm asking my wife, how do you decide how to forgive people?
Well, we try to find out what their situation is, and if they say, hey, I'll never be able to make up that amount, usually we figure out a way to help them.
What do you mean help them?
Help them get zero. We'll donate points or whatever.
So you donate, so you basically forget. How do you donate points
You
in the
receive
babysitting?
the application. allows you to give points to others.
Oh, okay. So you can forgive the debt by giving some of your balance to someone else. Okay, got it.
Most of the time, we're friends, so most of the time.
Cool. Who else wants to chime in? This is like super lively. It's like, oh, we don't want to let other people speak, but I know that Victor, you're saying you're super interested in that, and Olivia and Eyal, I'm sure you have things to say, and Michal.
Yeah, I prefer to listen a little bit more first to sort of have a broader picture of the things that have been discussed yet before I'm gonna say something myself.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that really moved me when I first met Adam as well was that I wanted to bring up is that we were talking about the commons, and Adam said, it just seems crazy to me that people could be born without a home. Like, if you're a bird, you're born into a home. Like, how does that happen? And that was a really moving conversation. Eyal, I saw you unmuted.
Yeah. Hey, everybody. Having a bit of technical difficulties this week. But I gotta say, I'm a little lost in this entire subject because it really blows out to theory in my mind. And when I look at that, like, the basic idea of that is unrealistic, right? And if we're talking about the exchange of capital and labor, and specifically like babysitting, then like, if that's something that one person's supposed to do, it's very obvious when that leaves reality. Like if they're supposed to make up more hours that there are in the week, then the debt becomes meaningless. So to me, it's sort of a mechanism that has to be very tightly controlled. And if we're talking about what you said, Grace, then I sort of don't see it that way about most things, that I don't think people are obligated to help each other. And the idea that a bird gets born into a home, I find to be a bit romantic, but try being a snake. Okay, you have that burrow where you were born, but you're totally on your own in the world. And of course, there is always that question of like basic income, where you're going to get it. And to me, I think this whole subject, of course, if you don't want to look at capital itself as rent seeking, is really about the exchange of labor and capital. That is the only constant in history, I think. Like, there's always been that idea of a man's hour of labor, right? And what's changing the impact on that is like technology. And now we can create so much value with that same currency of labor that we're starting to talk about universal income and basically being able to give things for free and have that multiplier. So I think I'll leave it there and hand it over to Victor.
There was something happening to my Zoom, like I minimized it, so I had to open it again. Well, I think that the remarks that you made, Eyal, about sort of it being in a way part of all of human history or all of human nature, or like every culture's, that there's a thing of like the value of labor and being alone in the world. I think that is historically and anthropologically not true. So yeah, like in many successful civilizations that were based on this combination of patriarchy and private property, and the accumulation also of like possessions over generations, you end up in a situation that is structured like this, but it is not necessarily the case. And I think the notion of commonly managing the commons is an alternative to precisely this sort of breaking up everything in the sort of possessions of a person and giving that to like next generations that get born into more, whereas other people are born into less, or even born indebted to people with possessions. So that was something that crossed my mind when I heard the story.
I just want to clarify, just to make sure about what I said, that what I meant is like that the only constant that I can see across everything is time. That is, there are always, like, of course, life expectancy changes, but we all have the same amount of time in the day and the same amount of time in the year. And I sort of try to use that as my base because everything else is so liquid.
If I can chime in here, kind of, like tying the two discussions. So, we spoke a lot about this mutual credit and, community currencies and stuff like that. And then it started a little bit with basic income. And then, when we speak income, at least for me, it means that, something was produced. So, something was earned. So it's income, but income has to come from somewhere. So it has to come from, some kind of productive capacity or some kind of a surplus. So then we can distribute this universal basic income or services or whatever else, right? And then going back to the original topic about, like free riders and rent seekers, I'm thinking a lot about communities and how do you engage communities, at least the ones that I'm part of, right? And kind of a rule of thumb that I'm realizing is that 80% of people, they are not engaged. So you could consider them the typical, basically free riders, right? So they have the benefits, but they don't contribute. Then somewhere between 15 to 20% would be, like people who are relatively engaged. So from time to time, like they be engaged, but not in a high capacity. And most of, like the heavy lifting is done by, let's call them super contributors. It might be, like 1% to maybe 5% tops, who are basically driving the whole community forward. And going back, to this thing about UBI, to distribute UBI, someone first has to put in the effort to, like produce the things that will be distributed, whether that's, services, whether that's money or, like produce or something else. So I'm just curious because it seems that basically most of the communities have 80% of basically free riders. So there's a huge overhead on those super contributors to keep it running. So, that's kind of like, like UBI scheme already for most of the communities we have.
Yeah, and I think that's true everywhere. Like if you look, oh, there's all these government, well, I just got my driver's license. The number of pieces of paper that had to be pushed for this, and I've been driving for 30 to 36 years, right? And I had to go do this, and that, like all that was useless work. So, but I think that this is a really interesting question because what it brings up for me is there's an emotion associated with this. I'm teaching this workshop on this, and I've noticed that as somebody who does a lot, right? I get a lot done, and whenever I've been in a company, I overperform, and I'm doing all kinds of stuff. And right now, I'm probably producing a little bit less, but this call and whatever, it has never bothered me that I'm that person that does more than other people and doesn't necessarily get a higher salary. It never has been of concern of me when I'm thinking about things like universal basic income, that, okay, there's going to be those 80, like, let those people sit on a rock because they're getting in my way. Like, really, they're getting in my way. But I've also noticed there are people who feel the exact opposite. There's somebody in my course that whenever we talk about this, he's obviously an overachiever. It pisses him off that he's not going to get recognized and he's not going to get more and he's not going to whatever because he's doing all the work, right? And I've noticed there's just a huge emotional range here between, like, just let them sit on a rock, they're in my way, and I don't mind, I'll support them. And that's true in families. There's some families where somebody's supporting all 8 people and they don't care, and there's some families where that's resentment, and there's some families, like, I don't want to talk about specific people in my family, they got more money than anybody needs in the family, and they're like, you're going to still have to work for it because, in my generation, that's how it was, or they let their brothers starve on the street, so it's really, it's really become apparent when you said that, Michał, that this is actually an emotional issue. Like, how do you emotionally feel about those people who are actually kind of incompetent anyway?
I mean, look, Grace, they don't have to be incompetent, but, like now I'm thinking, and it sounds a bit rough, but, where do you draw the line between, people who need support versus parasites? Because, like, it's nice to...
You froze.
Yeah, I want to say that.
Yeah. Yeah. But just, yeah, like, yeah. But, and again, that's an emotional issue. And it's also that's why I liked Will's post that he had. about, like, they sit around as a community every year and decide that. I feel like that's one of the problems with universal basic income that you guys pointed out. Like, it's not going to be universal how each group or community or society decides those people should be dealt with. Like, if you're a leech, what happens? There's going to be people like that. Do you get thrown out? You know,
like the Red Cross can go out there and say, you as a community, you know, you're doing whatever, you know, like, we're not judging you and we're just going to give you food because I see you starving, and move on with like, all they care about is that they're better and alive in that moment, like that day, and then they go on to the next one because there's not enough time and energy to stay there in that community and help them rebuild. So you get a lot of this sort of, like, you know, mass handing out of stuff that happens, and there's a huge amount of waste in it too. It's like, you know, 20% actually gets to the people who need it, kind of thing, and that would be good, you know. And often it's just like you have really no idea. Sorry, I got some dogs here. Yeah, I think it's a huge issue. I don't like the idea that, you know, like, we need, it is an emotional issue in a sense, like, you know, it's also a choice, right? There's a real conscious decision here of what do you value, and maybe we say we're not good enough at valuing and therefore we just value everyone. And I like that. I think that's, you know, that sense of universality is super important. But I do think we can give the power more to the people to decide that somehow. And, you know, and then you get into this again, like the protocol-esque levels of it, right? Like, well, they're allowed to do that as long as they adhere to these protocols. Otherwise, they're isolated in a sense. They can't connect with the rest. You know, they don't have the frequency to connect back with the mothership, kind of thing, right? Like, they're an island now. But if you want to do your basic income however you want to do it, great. If it's within these parameters, you can now connect with all the others, right? Yada yada yada. If you really don't agree with the mothership, then make your own, you know, that sort of thing. I think all of this sort of social engineering kind of stuff is just we're experimenting on ourselves in a way, and it's just so hard to do. And we're also in crisis right now as a species. Good times.
I saw
Yeah.
Adam for Victor, and then Livia. Did you have your hand up, Adam? Yeah, good. And then Victor, and then Livia.
Even you want me to speak first? Okay. Well, I think that there's a whole, I mean, maybe this goes along with rent seeking, but I think there's a whole lot of value that that is there, that's kind of been cordoned off for whatever reason. I suppose that is what rent seeking is. And then after we've done that, then we tell people that you know, that the only way that they can get their, you know, what they need to live, or their fair share or whatever, is they, you know, they have to do something, or they have to work for it or whatever. But if like so look at natural resources, like if the natural resources have been taken away so that the average person just doesn't have access to the natural resources which provide most of what they need to survive, it's not really that someone else is providing for them. What really is happening is someone else is taking away from them and then telling them what they have to do to get back the thing that they've taken away from those other people. And so that's almost seems to have become invisible to us, that there's things that have just been taken away, like a huge amount. I think the amount that's been taken away is greater than the amount that we get from other people. And so that throws a huge imbalance into this equation. So I hope we don't forget that.
Yeah, Victor was next, and then Livia.
Yeah, well, I was so captured by what Adam was saying that I kind of forgot what I wanted to say.
I wanted to speak more about the emotional point, because I think it's so crucial and undervalued, especially in like tech communities. I feel like when we have smaller systems, like my house, for example, it's kind of like a commons, like everyone brings a certain contribution that it's not necessarily the same, but it has a flow and we have an understanding of this flow. And recently we had someone coming in that was a free rider. And then how do we address the situation of someone being a free rider? So when you're in a small system, you can invite that person for a talk, and there is communication, and you're able to show what are your values. Everyone expresses values, frustrations, all of this, and it's so much easier to come to an agreement and to see like, oh, okay, there's points that this person can improve, like we all understood, or there's points that we can improve, because then we understand that if something is coming up in the system, it's the responsibility of the whole system and not only of that one person. Even if the system allowed for that behavior to be happening, the whole is responsible for it. And I feel like that's much harder to do in large communities and in tech communities. One, because people are very resistant of emotional work and of seeing the importance of this in the systems that we're building. And two, because there's not so much space for intimacy, that it's where you can feel safe to share values, and have a space to solve conflicts in a more nurturing way.
Yeah, and I think there's not as much interest. Like, why would you if you're the person benefiting from the system? You know, I mean, I think about that a little bit. I was thinking about like some of the stuff I'm working on now and why I feel like, wow, I'm just kind of dragging my feet through. Like, I should have by now be running something, you know, I just keep writing these business plans and trying to raise money for them, or, you know, whatever, donations for them. I'm like, wow. And I just think about like my whole history of 30 years in high tech and how all these men around me were raising money and then, you know, having exits and I never really thought, you know, like it's kind of the systemic thing where, you know, when I was the age when people were raising money, 2% of the money went to women. And I never really thought about it but in retrospect, I'm like, wow, here I am and I'm 52 and I'm the result of this whole system. But what I also wanted to say about like the forgiveness thing, I do think that has to be done at smaller levels. And I don't think there's any problem with that. Like you could have a basic, whatever needs be allocated by a bigger authority, but it gives authority to the lower levels to make those decisions about what to do with their free riders. And I think some of it is cultural. Like what I love, I mean, one of the things I love about Will's project, like I'm not crazy about these, you know, money type currencies, but I love Will's project because Will's come into a location where people lost agency because of so much aid. And if you have a free rider problem for long enough and somehow it keeps getting funded, then you've got 40 years of hunger in Africa. And all that those donations have done is exacerbated people's feelings of, you know, entitlement, and somebody should just give me money instead of people's feeling of independence. And I think what Will's project has done in an incredibly short amount of time is give communities back their agency and their belief in themselves and their, you know, and so I think that's the other aspect of this like free rider problem. And the rent seeking as well, like as you get richer and richer, you get a sense of entitlement. Well, I just put money in the bank and it's supposed to get interest, and I take the risk of investing in your companies and I should get that money. And so both on the rich side and the, you know, getting donated side, you have these rent seekers and free riders who've got like mentally this sense of entitlement. Somebody was telling me like about somebody in England, they were saying, you know, for 3 generations, these people live on half welfare. And, you know, because the country kind of gives you some minimal something. And it's just this crazy system that makes you feel like, oh, well, that's how it's always been. The government takes care of me. And
yeah,
you know, yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry to, no, you finish your thought.
That was my thought. It's like there is
Oh,
a
okay.
societal, there is a long-term societal impact of, you know, allowing these behaviors to happen. You know, there's a long-term societal impact.
When you were saying England, it just, the thing that immediately came to my mind was the manor system, where when you started talking about generations, the fact that it's even become romanticized to where we watch like these movies like Pride and Prejudice or something, and think like, oh, that's so romantic. Like, I wish I lived in that system and I could have servants waiting on me hand and foot, and it's like they play cards all day, and they only, it's like they talk about you know, inheritances and stuff like that, and it's like it's just become totally normal to them that that's the way it should be. You know, they should have this huge amount of wealth. So yeah.
Yeah, I think defense systems are super important, because like no matter at what scale, someone's going to be comfortable eating off your back. You know, maybe the closer that is to you, like, we can deal with it. But if it's like an invasion, or like, you know, the Arabs start the slave trade here on the coast, you know, in Kenya, well, how are you going to stop that? And especially if they have something like spices that you really like. You know, I mean, you know, that's a weird example, but you know, we're weird animals. We really like do sort of need to, like, you know, zoo ourselves in a good way. Like, we know what we need in our zoo. We need to be pet on our heads 3 times a day. We need food. We need friendship. We need smiles and, you know, hugs and stuff like that, right? Like, you know, we know what the animal kind of needs to be at optimum levels. And that's like, you know, it is sort of clustering. You know, maybe it's digital, like we're doing right now. We're having our little huddle, you know. But yeah, I like that concept, anyways, of locality and but also, you know, networks connecting, and then those are the units that we want to sort of like connect with and replicate and have protocols between. You were reminding me one quick second of Bright IDs and the protocol, because, you know, thinking about the identity protocol, even of like who do you identify your network? Well, that belongs to that network, right? And then there's, you know, protocols for sharing that information out. But I like the idea of the decentralization sort of approach, and I feel like that's where a lot of this motif and blockchain and you know, proof of work, even as a concept, also came from, is sort of like clustering. You know, like, who can be involved in this activity? We're going to reward them for that. That's all we can do. That is our volition as this group that I self-identify. I think acknowledging our non-infiniteness, right? Like, we don't have infinite resources on the planet, right? There's not an infinite amount we can give to anybody, you know? Like, yeah, I'll stop there, guys.
Yeah, I like what you said about this you know, this localization. It reminds me, when I try to explain decentralized technologies to people, I sometimes talk about proof of work in this way, that it's like, right now, if you want to get married, you go down to an official place and they give you a document, and just you and the person you're marrying has to be there, and that official. But in a traditional society, everybody has to go to the wedding, and then they all see it happening, and that's proof of marriage, is everybody saw it and witnessed it, and then it's done. And so you didn't need like a piece of paper, but, you know, you wear a little dot on your head or a ring on your finger. But actually the event itself was a big wedding in the center of town that everybody knows about it, like, oh, that one's no longer single. And that's kind of what decentralization is offering us. And how do we, I think that this is the question that we're approaching, is, right, how do you create that level of validation of something like, this person is in good standing, or this person is a lazy bum, or this person is like, don't just get, you know, like, feed him and send him off because he's a jerk or whatever. Like, how do you create that at a larger scale level so that we can belong to many communities? Because we do belong to many communities, and each community has different values. And, you know, should we let somebody into this call or not, right? That, you know, so far I haven't had to do anything about that, but, right, there's like, this community would decide as a whole, like, okay, that person isn't contributing. How would that look? Yeah, Adam.
Yeah, so there's a topic that, I mean, we don't have to change topics now, but there's a really interesting topic to me, which is if I want to create something that I view as a public good, and we, in the description of the topic, we were talking about, or it mentioned DAOs and how like a DAO could be involved in this, but like a decentralized autonomous organization. But so I'm in this situation where I kind of thought, and there are a few other people that thought this with me, that if we create a DAO, we can manage a public good and allow everyone to get equal access to it. And so how do you create a situation where you maximize the access to a public good and you're still able to maintain that public good? So how do you as I guess like the community or the DAO or whatever that is responsible for creating this public good, how does it maintain that public good, make sure that it gets the resources that it needs to keep doing that? So I'd like to hear about that sometime, because it's really kind of on my mind.
Actually, I have a thought related to that, and based on previous Will's comment, which is probably try not to make people too comfortable. And why is that? So Will mentioned those defensive systems, and they're very, very important. And I saw, quite a few different edge cases of those. So the example that comes to my mind is the refugee crisis, right? So it was 2 years ago or maybe 3 years ago. And there were, for example, people were trying to go to Sweden, they were trying to go to England with those, social nets and perceived high quality of living, but they didn't want to go to Poland, okay? And I'm a Polish citizen, I haven't lived there for a while, but the last time I went to Poland when I was finishing my PhD, I wanted to get basic health insurance, and despite having paid taxes for more than 10 years, in Poland, I was not entitled to any kind of basic health insurance. Basically, I would need to pay a few thousand euros of a fine and then pay monthly to get any kind of, like basic health coverage versus, like if I were a refugee, like that would be granted to me. I mean, of course, that's an extreme case and I would not like to be a refugee because those people, like are in a really bad situation. But as Will said, like if you're in dire straits, close to dying, and there is a place where they would just, hand you stuff out. I mean, which kind of sane person would not do that, especially if their safety and their family's safety is compromised, right? So then, of course, they want to go to places that are better. And I also know the example of Sweden. So that was almost 15 years ago. I did kind of, like work and travel. And we ended up with friends in this kind of, social immigrant neighborhood where we realized that most people were, like likely Muslims because of, their attire, and plenty of kids. And why was that? So it turned out, and I haven't checked that, but it seems that you would get money per each child. And if you had like more than 3 children, you would get an apartment. So what would happen is that you would have those families with at least 3 or 4 kids, which would be effectively getting a few thousand euros per month and at least 80 square meter apartment for free. So again, compare that to, let's say, Central Europe, like Poland, that you have to take a mortgage for 30, 40 years to pay off, a similar type of apartment. So, like one is definitely too comfortable and the other one is too uncomfortable. So I think it's about this healthy balance of people not being too comfortable, because Adam, you said that you want to open access, but yeah, if everyone has easy access, then at some point, like they might be open to abuse it. So probably it's just offering them a healthy bit of discomfort, so they don't get too comfortable and just take it as a given. I mean, like how that could look like in the context of DAO, I'm not sure yet. But like I'm realizing that if you make people too comfortable, like with this, social support system in England, or other stuff like that, this is oftentimes where things go wrong. So you need a safety net, but too much is bad.
I have problems with the word DAO because I just, I think of it as a set of contracts. And I feel like we sometimes blur the term there. But imagine you have a commons of labor, right? And so if you were going to allow this commons to exist, and I use the terms commitments and projects a lot, but usually what I'm talking about between commitments and projects is the commons of all that's being desired and offered in that community, like the collective work. You know, we all own our labor, but there is a collective of everything, our capacity in a way. It's our future production, right? This commons. And to measure that, you know, the idea of staking, I guess, comes in, and saying, well, okay, you know, we are going to acknowledge some level of stake here. This person claims a commitment of X, right? And we're going to give him Y, right? And then there's things people vote on, and that is projects. And generally a project would be like a collective farming, or even collective loaning becomes a project. Projects can also be the jobs of other people, right? So their commitments can be towards projects. So there's this weird space in terms of a commons in that sense. And the way I would think of a commons in other ways is just in the sense of saying, well, let's tokenize it, right? Let's create a value based on the services around it and through it and with it. You know, like the commons of this forest I'm in right now is maintained by rangers who are paid, and there's a whole economy around it. So it is sort of tokenized in that sense already, but we need to do it at that scale of that region. Otherwise, there's no, you know, so like the neighboring villages around here, they will come and just take and take and take from that. And so there was this thing, and it wasn't that long ago, created here called community forest associations. So they would give over the ownership of that forest, which includes like the support in a budget to manage it from central government as well, but the mandate to you know, be responsible for it. And that meant they could also like harvest honey from it and do all these cool projects in it. Well, as before, those projects were illegal. So now, as long as they take care of that group, that ecosystem, they're allowed to do those projects. I mean, that's how it is in theory. In practice, like the prisons drive up in big lorries, cut down all the trees, and make furniture out of them. But in some cases, it does work really well. But there's always, you know, again, like defensive systems necessary, even from within.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Ian.
Yeah, so I actually want to connect what Will was saying to scale and to what others were mentioning. So what Livia talked about really got me thinking about scale and about just, you know, roommates and having that emotional investment to solve something. And when I was thinking about it on a community scale, you realize it's much more complex. So essentially, I think the majority, or however you look at it, would have to take upon himself the problems of that, say, leeching or parasitical community in order to negotiate that. Or, of course, the other option is to cut them off and to sort of have that die. And I think that on the individual level, we all agree, like Mikhail said, that there has to be like a safety net, and we want everybody to have enough food and somewhere to sleep. But on the community level, I'm not sure that death has the same meaning. And in a sense, if you have a community that's parasitical, you will have it will probably need to die if it wants to stay a part of the whole, in some sense. You know, when it reaches some level.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, what if you had that island of, you know, the island of criminals, right? And nobody wants to trade with them, right? Like,
you're talking about Australia, right?
Exactly. We sent them where there's big crocodiles and snakes.
Sorry. Wait, can I say something?
And now we're buying rice from them, so maybe that worked.
Yeah, Victor.
Yeah, I think like there's also on different levels of scale these type of cultural patterns that have something to do with when or when not something is seen as parasitical, and also to what extent like sort of different things can be combined. For example, even something as small as the family. So last Monday, I went like for the first time in a super long time to eat out in a restaurant with my brother and my sister. And I am living on a welfare program, so on the absolute minimum of the Netherlands, whereas my sister is a well-paid consultant and my brother is a well-paid like landlord, and next to that also having a job. So they're always kind of like bidding onto each other, like sort of who has the most money, who is the most societally successful, and also for this reason, kind of like logically, I can just de facto never participate in their sort of social culture of like how they also want to, you know, like with going to this luxurious restaurant with sort of small tapas and like sort of very fancy things and like this sort of and yeah, you know, like to me also it's a total meme. I mean, like I can also laugh about it, but you know, like I could never ever participate. They just spend on a meal only the food without the drinks, but I have to live off in a week, you know, like it's really yeah. But the point is then, you know, like they sort of invite me and then almost necessarily, you know, like they offer me, but it always goes like this, you know. So then it is in a way parasitical, but it's also maybe
You've got to refuse. Sorry, I'm just laughing. I said, don't give in next time. Don't give in.
No, I mean, yeah, like another time maybe, you know, like I can invite them to do something and then, you know, go somewhere where I can afford it. But the point is, and this is also in small groups of friends, and I've had it also, like sort of being the one with persistently the least money, even in a place where stuff is cheap. At some point, like there is this disbalance of, you know, like you participating in a social environment and then paying slightly less than the others, so that on the long run you kind of like are sort of getting in debt in a way by participating all the time. And I think these differences and things also happen on societal levels in complex ways.
Yeah. Lua, did you want to say something? I saw you unmuted and you haven't spoken yet.
Oh, yes. I did not unmute. That was an accident. I wanted to speak a while back. I wanted to add to Michael's perception about the differences with refugees and other people. That kind of happens not just in Sweden, but also I've been living in Germany for the past 7 years, and here it's also a struggle with having everything in a legal sense acceptable by the German government in terms of immigration, paperwork, whereas it's very easy if you are part of the European Union or a refugee. It's really complicated for people who don't fit into those boxes to actually just integrate, even if you speak the language, even if your friend circle is at least half of the local people, and you're pretty much integrated in the society. Just the fluidity isn't present. And I wonder about what systemic incentives there are to actually have people integrate who want this, but are somehow kept apart from the whole community because of bureaucracy, because of these endless loops of organization and boxes that you need to fit to be accepted. That's unfortunate in every place, I think.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I'm aware also of how much that has to do with money. Like, as somebody who's not an EU citizen, you know, I've been, look at, you know, I'm here in Slovenia, and that requires me to keep my income at a certain level and pay a certain amount of taxes and do a certain amount of things. And I've been thinking about other countries and whatever, but I don't want to move because, you know, like, and it really is a function of money. Like, if you know, if I had $500,000, which isn't a huge amount of money, I could live wherever I wanted pretty much. You know, I could, and with $2 or $3 million, I could get a passport pretty much anywhere I wanted. And so it's, you know, it really is like this thing, like your social status depends on your money, and there's kind of a, you know, it's unpleasant.
So,
Yeah.
Grace,
Go
I
ahead,
don't
Rahel.
fully agree. And Analua, to your comment, I don't know if this is a solution, but it feels like it's very much related to abundance versus scarcity, right? So a lot of the division we have now in Europe, it's, you know, like those immigrants taking our jobs, taking our, you know, social benefits and so on. So it comes from the scarcity kind of mindset. And Grace, why I don't fully agree, because we're working now, like I'm part of a group that is trying to survey a community of, you know, 1,500 people. And we had a lot of discussions about how to ask a question about, let's say, how comfortable people are financially, right? Because one of the things we want to understand is, are we mostly privileged, and are people not participating because, for example, their financial situation went down, or, you know, they can't afford it anymore because they have, you know, kids or other stuff to spend on, right? And the interesting point was that a lot of people who are kind of a test group for that question, they said they're financially comfortable even though they don't have that much money. So, you know, like it feels that they have all that they need. So they're kind of, you know, like in state of abundance, even if they don't have that much money. And of course, there's the opposite spectrum. So there are people who have plenty of money and they also all the time feel that it's not enough and everything is scarce, right? So yeah, I mean, like there's probably a bare minimum that you need in terms of money, but the rest is probably mindset.
And probably the people with more are carrying more debt. Back to our debt question. I want to kind of wrap that around to something that came up, but I just kind of realized, just kind of sunk in for me when How talked about this 80-20 problem. Like there's a 20%, you know, doing the work, and you know, this whole problem of, okay, if you've got free riders and rent seekers, and they're this percentage, like I'm going to talk about free riders because in the rent seeking situation, those are the people with all the money and all the power, but you've got a few free riders, and it's slowly becoming like part of your society that sitting on your ass is perfectly fine, but you've got the overworked people. And there's this interesting question, like we were saying, oh, well, the community as a whole should decide. But wait a second, is that one person, one vote? Or is that 20% people who are busting their asses, do they get a bigger vote because they're the one being the producers? Like how does, and I'm saying vote loosely, right? It might be a consensus or a discussion. How would that look, and how does that work? And does that, you know, how does that ring for people? Yeah.
I just want to say that it seems to me that a lot of times the rent seekers think that they're the productive people. And so I think you have to solve that perception problem before you can really have a discussion with everybody on, you know, a proper discussion with everybody. You've got to, if you really want to know who's doing the work, you've got to like figure out a way to like figure out what is the useful work, because is shoving, okay, I mean, I'll tell you about the highest paid people that I know, because I've worked in this industry before. They basically follow these lines that go up and down, and you know, they you know, if they can guess right about whether the line goes up or down in a certain way, then they get money. And so they spend all their time, it would, you know, they might spend 80 hours a week on it trying to guess whether the line's going to go up or down. And to them, they're like really hard workers, but maybe to society they're less than useless. So, you know, how do you I think you have to, before you can figure out like who, you know, it's not just about how much time you put in. You've got to have some way of discussing, are you really a contributor or not? And that's not easy. Like, it's not easy to separate that out. Sometimes it is. I mean, if you're like in the manor system, you can kind of figure out, well, okay, you seem to be supporting yourself on, like, by doing nothing except holding this title. So it's pretty obvious. But some of these other jobs, they feel like jobs. Or maybe if you're the manor, the person who owns the manor, you feel like, okay, well, managing, like telling all these people what to do to serve me is like work. And so maybe I am, you know, maybe I am doing work. So I think there's that confusion there.
Yeah. And there's work and there's also risk, right? With these, frontline workers, or if you're a surgeon, you're, ICU unit person, you're a frontline worker, but also if you're a cashier. So, there's also risk and not just work. Will, I see you're unmuted.
There was this old Ayn Rand thing, like the Republicans in America really got onto it, and it was like the idea of, and she has some term for it, I'm sure. It's a very like, something like people should be happy where they are, so like if the street sweeper, like he can strive to be better, but he should be like content in his station in life, kind of thing, like a sort of a justification in a way of inequality. And
but that sounds like the opposite to actually the whole American culture, the American dream, like from street sweeper to millionaire. So
well,
but really, like, I didn't know that Ayn Rand said that. Like, I'm super surprised. But anyway.
Well, there's these two sides to America, I mean, and many more sides than that, of course. But like the idea of wealth and being earned, and that there is this possibility that you can climb up in the ranks and whatnot. But like, you shouldn't, if you and the next 5 generations of your family end up as street sweepers, like, great, maybe the next generations after that will become wealthy, kind of thing, right? It's sort of a sick version of capitalism. Right. Well, it is the version of capitalism, I think. And so that's sort of the negative side of America, is that there's a beautiful idea of democracy and statehoods and stuff like this, but there's this sort of veneer of justification, like the evangelicals, in the South, like total justification of the world as it is, the status quo. And I find that everywhere. Like there's always this justification of the status quo, and it just gets to be so big that no one can challenge it.
Yeah, it's a really funny point. I remember that a few years back, someone raised the point that companies are investing a lot in mindfulness of their workers. But the thing is that the workers need the mindfulness because the work and the employers are so shitty. So instead of fixing the original problem, then just tell them, do more mindfulness and everything will be.
That's awesome.
Something weird happened there. I think how you were in the middle of talking and then accidentally pressed mute or something.
No, I just finished.
Oh, okay. You were talking so fast I didn't follow the whole point, but okay, cool.
Well, I like Mikhail's point in terms of, look, there is situations where, people feel justified in doing whatever to each other. And I just, how to solve that as a species is not from the outside. It has to be some sort of healing from within kind of situation, which is hard to do. And, like the Red Cross, flower for the masses kind of, approach in terms of like basic income. And as you said, like defining what is basic, then it's still a big decision. And it's not necessarily a bad one. So, like I do believe in there being sort of like a mixture of, bootstrapping large organizations and lots of giving birth to smaller organizations that no longer need the mothership. But ideally, they're still in the same protocol with it, right? Like if that protocol is good enough. And I think this protocol level of connection is a really interesting, just conscious choice, like saying, well, okay, listen to I feel like most of our complaints right now are about the rent seekers. And it's like saying, okay, you guys have a lot. We're in crisis in the world right now. You're a billionaire. I see all the news about Jeff Bezos making the next billion, whatever, a minute. And I think, well, how on earth are you going to enable the next generation of currencies to form? And maybe, allowing Jeff Bezos onto the first seat of the bus, right, is a good viral mechanism to enable the protocol to spread. And that protocol enables anyone holding any currency in the world to create their own, right? And connect and choose to connect with those. I mean, it doesn't have to be the protocol we're using exactly, but it's it's just a simple little, mathematical tool, right, that could be put into anything. So like, I like the idea of some sort of viral memes like that, of just saying, well, how do we inject the protocol, right? And to allow, right now we're using Swiss francs, I mean, is the idea anyways. we're still on DAI, where we haven't moved fully yet. But that's basically saying, yeah, okay, it's a national currency for sure. It's like, regulated by all these authorities and a bank in Switzerland, right? That's all it is. It's like USDC, but in Switzerland, kind of. And it's like, well, okay, take whatever is the most trusted thing we can possibly get right now and make something viral out of it, right? Let them decide the next time what, currency they're going to use. I mean, we're donating that one, right? So they have that one now. That's the best we could do, and then ideally the next generation makes their own. And, it's like sort of like you're building Lego blocks into your basic, cell, right? Like, how do they connect with each other? If that's not in there, and we don't really, like, I'm pretty much totally agnostic on what you use the currency for. It's a token. It could be a tokenized asset. It could be tokenized labor. It could be whatever it is. It could be tokenized gas prices, right? Gas costs or native tokens. As long as there's a protocol for that token to automatically connect and value itself against other tokens, then you have something that's really interesting. And then, you can have baskets of these things too, right? So it's not like a one reserve has to rule them all kind of thing, right? And you can create relays between reserves. So you have kind of like mountain ranges in a way.
Yeah,
like,
I feel like we're getting a little bit off
massive.
topic, though, with the, So Adam, you had something to say, and then Victor, and then maybe we'll do a closing round. Adam had his hand up first, I think. So Adam and then Victor, and then we'll just do a closing round.
Thanks. This is just a point of clarification. Just a quick question I wanted to ask Will. What did you mean by giving Jeff Bezos the first seat on the bus?
I mean, we're using CHF right now, right? Jeff Bezos has a lot of US dollars, right? So if Jeff Bezos wants to invest into the collateral of a CIC, right, he's going to get a lot of that CIC, right? Up to a limit, right? It's diminishing returns. So, he can't invest that much into each individual CIC, but he could. And so what does that mean? Like, essentially it means he's going to mint, like, let's say a community has 4,000 tokens. He's going to mint the next 4,000, say, before he's got so little diminishing returns that he can only mint, for $1 million, one of that currency, right? You can imagine that curve, right? So essentially what he's done is he's added liquidity to the pool. All those people can cash out all that money that he just put in, right? Like, what does he have over that community? Well, he has the right to employ them. I agree that I don't like the idea that we are bringing on historical wealth, but I also don't really blame those people who have it. Like, I think myself in a million different versions could have been the plantation owner or whoever, like, I think it's within us as a species, and we're trying to get rid of it. Like, we're trying to, like, socialize out violence and hatred and all those things, but it's still there. And just to say, well, okay, these people have it. They have problems of various degrees. Some of them are just rationalizers. Like, I don't know how. I mean, and look at the sphere right now. Everything's for profit. Everyone's just trying to cut out their little square. Well, what if instead you cut out squares, but you don't cut them out? You just let everyone in the world cut out their own squares, and you give those guys something to invest in that is maybe more real than something else that they've invested in, right? In terms of maybe data and impact and meaning, and who knows, I just think that we have to, I mean, like, I got to deal with Red Cross funds, right? So in a way it's similar. I mean, it's not Jeff Bezos, but Red Cross would be ecstatic if Jeff Bezos gave the funds, right? It's a weird dichotomy of bootstrapping, I feel like we're in. And so, like, what's the next stage? And for me, it's just implanting viral shit into the current stage, right? Which is kind of where we are right now. Like, we are in this stage of our stable token's going to become the next versions of whatever, our central bank's going to issue their own tokens. Are we going to, replicate the existing system on the blockchain? And I say, yeah, we probably fucking are, and we're already doing it. And how do we make it different is by, it's basically empowering people to use those as reserves,
Yeah. So
which is,
Victor,
I
you
don't know,
wanted
it's a
to,
weird thing. Eventually,
sorry, I just kind of want to like,
sorry, go
yeah,
ahead.
like keep moving because we're towards the end. I want to have everybody have a chance. So Victor?
Yes. Well, to respond to the exact same thing, I think there are alternatives in order to kind of like make things spread rather than sort of kind of compromising with really the top of the wealth of the sort of contemporary system. If you know well, actually their crypto token system, I don't know to what extent it had continued. Like I haven't followed up about it sort of so closely, but there is this platform called newlife.ai, and it was an app that was like wanted to sort of create an alternative for artists, especially in the realms of visual arts and fashion, to like share pictures and also kind of like engage with each other's content, and then sort of the behavior was like tokenized in the form of like a token, and it was quite smart, like how in the beginning phase sort of there was this involvement with sort of an upcoming movements in different art fields, and then also kind of like upcoming influencers that sort of lifted it out, and then like once it launched, and this sort of tokenized system that eventually would allow creators themselves to also get something from it beyond the way how it goes with the contemporary social media like Instagram, where you put in like a lot of stuff, not guaranteed that you're going to make it, or that, you know, if you bet early on a certain type of movement and you're early involved, then it's usually people with a lot of influence that sort of seize the package of a certain aesthetic and then like get rich with it in the mainstream, and then the people that developed it get near to nothing. So it wanted to circumvent that, and seemed at some point to succeed. So there are different ways to sort of make something spread and also increase sort of weight and therefore liquidity of people that engage in it and invest in it. But
Yeah.
I don't know.
I mean, I think we're seeing a lot of different trials and a lot of different models, and I feel like we are living in these parallel universes. And, there's people who are living in the old system and being very rich, and people who are living off the grid, and there's everything in between, and we're all trying these things. And we'll know the right answer when, on the other side. But in the meanwhile, there's just a lot of, I tend to think, everybody's going to try it in a different way. So if Will says, hey, we'll take money however it gets, and if somebody says we'll never take money no matter what, it's great. We have all those different degrees. And I think that's also what's great about these conversations on a weekly basis, is we all have different perspectives, and there's a understanding that there needs to be this biodiversity of what we're trying and where we are, and based on geolocations it's different, and it's really wonderful. So yeah, maybe everybody, if you just want to give a closing round, go ahead. Maybe I'll start with Livia. I'm going to start with Livia and then just pass it to the next person for the closing round.
I think what's most alive to me right now is still this human factor of how we can bring things that are more sensitive to circles and solve the problems that are systemic, but that we keep pointing like, oh, that person is a free rider, or that one, or and not looking at the collective and the self as a problem. And also how intrinsic motivation is so important to have these contributions going. I think even a person that has a lot of money, there are people that wouldn't necessarily need to work or to make decisions, but they do because they have an intrinsic motivation for that. And for me, something like a universal basic income would be nothing more than allowing everyone to have this possibility of having all their needs met in the first place, that they can reach that intrinsic motivation. Yeah, and that was a great talk. Thanks, everyone. I'll pass to Adam.
Thanks. Yeah, as always, I love just soaking things in, and I always come away with feeling like I still have questions, but that's okay. There's lots to learn, and with that, I'll pass it to Victor.
Yes, it was an interesting conversation. There's also many more things to say about it, but I wanted to, connect to what Livia was saying, which is also immediately, I think, an answer to the question that Mikko asked me in the chat. That what is needed is so dependent on kind of like the social cultural context, also like what you think that you need in order to participate in certain social situations, and what is driving the social situations, and the sort of the way that access to resources plays in those social situations, ways of enjoyment, ways of even like a courtship or families, or like, you know, sort of there's very deep, very like emotions and things, mindset have been shaped by cultures, by certain examples, certain images through media, what is normal and how we should do things, and the extent to which we want to materialize things for ourselves, and also think about ourselves and agency and yeah, it's like it's very complex and also very human. So to actually focus on those things, I think is indeed the most important thing when it comes to answering these questions. So yeah. I'll pass it on to Analua.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I'd like to build on the fact of the need for the human factor and the intrinsic motivation. That's definitely the basis for a lot of the movement. Another aspect is, I think, it's interesting to see, going back to the healing and the cohesiveness, how we can build up our collective mentality and group mentality, but also avoiding groupthink. So at the same time, maintaining our identities, but taking care of the group and the groups that we are in, because most of us don't have just one group. So seeing then, first of all, how we are adding to the groups that we're in, how we're being helpful, if we're being helpful. And then also in terms of the groups themselves, being open to possibilities of different groups even collaborating, because there's so much potential, there's so much capacity. We don't need to all be reinventing the wheel. We're all working on the same project with different perspectives. So I don't remember who was that said that about having always a different perspective and coming back from this. I think it was Grace that mentioned this. And I think that this is fundamental. And I'd like to pass it to Victor.
Victor passed it to you. You can't
Yes.
pass it back, man. You're trying to pass the potato back. You can't do that.
Well, I can say one short thing, that I'm doing a project that's actually going into exactly this, and I will share it as soon as possible when there's like something to show.
Well, you know, the last week of the month, we always have like talk about what you're working on. So definitely come to that one. Every month, the last one of the month is what are you working on? So come. So maybe Will, go ahead.
Sure. Hey. Here, I'll see if you guys can see me. Hello, everybody. I think the thing that strikes me the most is just, the communities you're in, and even like networks and Zoom groups, and they're precious, right? And the idea that like, some form of like, reciprocity between y'all is gonna like take you apart and stuff like that. Like I that's something that strikes me quite often. But I feel like this, like strong communities like that, it's not such a big deal. But I guess we'll find out in 200 years. They'll be like, fuck, that's when they tokenized everything. So, anyways, that's what's on my mind. Really good to talk with you guys.
How you're the next one.
Yeah, I'm walking around and I go to a louder place and there's someone calling me. But look, a great conversation as usual. I'm a bit stricken. I don't know that's how you say it. Basically, by how important the perceptions are. I mean, like the example from Adam, it's like, I'm a trader and I add so much value, I produce so much money for other people. That's why I'm paid so much. I mean, how to explain to that person that you might not be making the world a better place? So perceptions, super interesting. And then, also I'm listening recently about the podcast about neuroscience. So essentially, it's all in our brain. Our brain doesn't even see the outside, okay? So it's just, like this funny complexity. The other thing is, micro versus macro. There are some things that we can figure out on the micro scale, like in the family, how to work some things out, or maybe not. Then on the macro scale, some things work out, kind of, like how to have society, democracy, and, do the things, or at least hope to do the things for the benefit for the society. But going from macro to micro, and having something applicable on those scales, that's very hard. And probably the hardest thing, and the third thing, is that those transitions are just insanely hard. So like if you start from scratch, it's easier. Also, like you need to overcome the perceived images that you have in your mind. But then I don't know, probably the person who can figure out how to go from like one state to the other state in a peaceful way, kind of like Prisoner's dilemma in the real world, should get the Peace Prize, like Nobel Peace Prize, because it's just so freaking hard to go from the state that we have with the legacy just to something completely new. But yeah, well, I'm hopeful, and I'm hopeful to take less than 200 years.
It reminds me of that old programmer's joke, like, why did it take the Lord only 6 days to create the earth, right? It created a whole world.
There was no debugging?
He started from scratch, exactly. It wasn't he had to debug. I mean, he's still debugging, but yeah, he started from scratch. So
Okay.
hopefully we won't get to that stage, although there are signs that we will get to that starting from scratch stages in many places. As usual, amazing conversation where I was so tempted to, take a turn when it wasn't my turn because there was so much to say. But thank you guys as usual. Next week, we're going to be talking about accountability. So in a decentralized system, how do people be accountable? I feel like that really connects a lot to what we were saying today about free riders and about the people who actually do the work. So that's going to be another awesome conversation next Wednesday. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care.